And there are certain areas where Hong Kong actually is, I would say, a leader regionally in corporate governance. And one area is, in fact, the voting by poll at annual general meetings. We find very few companies and very few markets around the region actually requiring mandatory voting by poll. Hong Kong does at least does require some mandatory voting by poll. And many of the leading companies are now, as a matter of course, voting by poll and publishing the results. So, that's good information for investors to know exactly how the vote went at different meetings. You don't see much of that around the region. So, that's an area where Hong Kong is definitely, I would say, ahead of most other markets in the region. Globally, I would say it's less impressive. I mean, some of our rules, some of the securities laws here are good. Some of the listing rules are pretty good. We now have a code of best practice that closely follows the UK code in most areas. But I would say there are other areas where Hong Kong doesn't stack up quite so well. One is in the regulatory structure. The fact that we've got this conflict between the SFC and the stock exchange. Another area is enforcement. We don't appear to be implementing or putting enough investment into enforcement. The exchange doesn't appear to be effectively enforcing a lot of its listing rules, particularly with regard to things like board structures and independent directors. And also the legal system in Hong Kong, it's very expensive. It's very difficult for shareholders to go to court, and the legal remedies available are quite limited. So those are some of the areas where I would say on a global level we aren't quite so impressive. But there's one other area that I would say regionally we're quite good, and that's the media. I would say Hong Kong does have a more open media than just about anywhere else. And I would say we get more real information in Hong Kong than you get in just about any other market in the region.
If you see the ranking of Hong Kong as a whole, as a country, we are not bad. We are ranked about the second in Asia, and I think about the top 20 or 30 in the whole world. Now, Hong Kong, of course, have all the good infrastructure and all the basic fundamental to lead to high CG. I think we have a very low corruption. We have a pretty good ethical standard. And we have a common law and independent legal systems. I think all this contributing to a very, very strong platform for Hong Kong to continue seeking further improvement. So actually, personally, I have a very high hope in Hong Kong. If everything works well, I think we have a high potential to become among the top on the list.
I think outside of London and New York, I think Hong Kong ranks as a very high second-tier market. And I mean that in the best possible way. I think that the change in the composition of this market in terms of the Chinese companies and the fact that the best Chinese companies are listed here, and on the whole, the quality of the governance of the big Chinese companies has been pretty good, has done much to enhance the quality of this market versus perhaps the traditional Hong Kong small private sector type companies. It's perhaps an irony of the development of the last 10 years that it's taken big centrally managed companies ultimately controlled by the government of China to greatly improve the quality of governance. So as such, I think you hold your head up when you're sort of in terms of saying, I work in Hong Kong and I work in this market. You don't apologize for it. And I think whilst we in the media are hopefully constantly critical and would hate to see ourselves as cheerleaders for the market, I think you can take a professional pride in that you're working in a serious place.
I actually think that the corporate governance practice in Hong Kong, although it is still in the early stage, the Appendix 14, i.e. the new code on corporate governance, was only effective, started 1st of January this year, 2005. But when I look at all the rules, especially for someone like us who is under the ruling of US, Hong Kong, and Shanghai, I actually think that the Hong Kong regulations is a much more pragmatic and a very reasonable one, and should be able to give a good check and balance on how a firm should do better in terms of corporate governance and transparency and disclosure as well. Because my own personal view is Sarbanes-Oxley and the US ruling is a bit over the top. And some of the things they mentioned are not very practical to do, and sometimes it's too costly as well. But I think what we have in Hong Kong is probably more appropriate. Now, the important thing is how the government or the regulator will be able to enforce and how the firms and the board could actually execute all this.
I believe that the largest organizations in Hong Kong can stand up to scrutiny against any comparison within the world. The difference perhaps in Hong Kong is that we have an amazing number of smaller organizations. There are actually very few large companies in Hong Kong to which you could apply the world standards. And I think one of the reasons is that the real driving force for better corporate governance isn't regulation, it's the use of the capital markets. People adopt it because they want to raise capital. And there are only a handful of companies, 20, 30 in Hong Kong, that really go out to the international markets and are subject to the discipline of the market.
Compared to those that I've experienced with, i.e. London and the Nasdaq, I actually feel that Hong Kong has very high standards of corporate governance already. And I think that the rules set by the SFC and the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and it's a unified exchange now, and I think there is I would not say that there's no room for improvement. There certainly would be. And I think the requirements and the standards of good corporate governance actually changes over time. So it's not a matter of Hong Kong not being good or being bad in absolute terms, but that they must see as the requirements change, as investors' requirements change, then I think Hong Kong obviously has to keep up if Hong Kong is going to keep its position as a maybe possibly the premier financial market in Asia. And I think that's obviously a goal that Hong Kong should aspire to, if not already be there. Because even though the Japanese market is bigger, it's a very different kind of market, and governance there is a totally different kind of thing. It is not as international a market as Hong Kong. And given the advent of some major listings out of China, I think Hong Kong has every reason to think and has the ability to become the premier financial market in Asia.
That's all we have time for today. Hong Kong has been able to build up an efficient and liquid stock market, second only to Japan in Asia. Despite the fact that most of our companies are family-owned, incorporated overseas, and controlled by majority shareholders, Hong Kong has evolved special solutions to its corporate governance problems. We hear so much these days about the need to keep up with international practice in corporate governance. But it is important to bear in mind that Hong Kong itself can be a role model. One of the elements of Hong Kong's success is the principles-based regulatory regime, which seeks to maintain a minimum level of corporate governance, while relying on market incentives to encourage companies to excel. In the next episode of Corporate Governance in Action, we will be looking at the future trends in Hong Kong's corporate governance environment. See you then.